we're going to go ahead and get started this evening. I want to welcome everybody to the Wilderness Wednesday, our first one for the winter season. And this is going to be white-tailed deer habitat by Jameson Maury. And he is an assistant research scientist at the Illinois Natural History Survey at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. They graduated from the UIUC in 2021 with a PhD in epidemiology and specialize in using statistics and computer modeling to answer questions related to disease and its impact on human and animals. They currently work in the Wildlife Veterinary Epidemiology Lab conducting research on white-tailed deer in Illinois with a focus on chronic wasting disease, which is CWD. Jameson uses mathematical tools to learn about relationship between white-tailed deer and their environment, disease, population, and other key factors. So why don't you just take it away, Jameson?
All right, thank you. And I appreciate you saying the alphabet soup of my affiliations. So yeah, my name is Jameson. I do deer, and I've done deer for the past 4 years or so as my primary research subject. And so yeah, I use math to make sense of the world, and to learn more about deer and their habitat and how we interact with them. Um, because it's interesting. Before we get started, I will offer the caveat that I am not a wildlife biologist and I'm not an ecologist. I am an epidemiologist by trade, but I have worked extensively with deer and deer data for the past several years. So I like to think I'm pretty familiar with it. But if you have any super specific questions, I may or may not be able to answer them right away, but I will get back to you. And speaking of questions, if you have any, feel free to either shout them out, put them in the chat right away, or we will have time at the end of this to do questions as well. And I will do my best to keep my eye on the chat for questions, but just feel free to interrupt me if I'm missing something. So. White-tailed deer. I probably don't need to even include a photo of what white-tailed deer are. We've all seen them everywhere, especially during harvest. And but just as a quick overview, white-tailed deer are medium-sized herbivores. They're native to all of the Americas, North, Central, and South. They're primarily in North America, though. Um, they have been introduced to other parts of the world, like Europe, some islands in the Caribbean, some islands in the Pacific, just folks who wanted to spice things up for hunting or whatever. But they are native to the Americas. So I'm just going to start off with some facts about white-tailed deer. Their Latin name is Odocoileus virginianus, and that is a mouthful, and I didn't learn to pronounce that correctly until like yesterday, so don't feel bad. Um, they are mammals, just like us. They're ruminants, and so that means they're like cows, they rechew their food to help them kind of process the tough stuff better. They're most active at dawn and dusk. You will see them out during the day sometimes, but especially during the summer when it gets really, really hot around midday, um, they pretty much stick to this dawn and dusk schedule to avoid the worst of that heat. Um, Deer are actually really strong swimmers, which I thought was really weird. But I have now seen videos of them swimming across the Mississippi, which makes them stronger swimmers than I am. Um, and they are also the Illinois state mammal. And I've got a little kind of like diagram here on the bottom right showing that uh, the typical male will stand at about 3 feet at the shoulder, with females being a bit smaller. So if you're 6 foot or you have any 6 foot friends, it's about half that height. Obviously, there is natural variation, um, and so they can. So in addition to being strong swimmers, a disturbing fact I learned is they can also jump from standing to about like 8 feet in the air. Um, And if you're ever bored, I recommend looking up photos or videos of this because it's wild. Because they can also jump up to 12 feet high from a running start. Uh, Absolutely crazy videos. Highly recommend it. Also a little scary, but they can also jump about 30 feet long, and this also increases if they're doing it at a running start. So very kind of like Olympian athletes almost. Some more facts. So on the reproductive side, females produce anywhere from 1 to 5 fawns per year in a litter. But overall, most are 1 or 2. The younger females tend to produce one, and the older females tend to produce two. So that's overall the norm. But in the data sets I have, there are deer that have 4 or 5 babies at a time. Um, and then in terms of like how they live and interact, their family groups, if you see a group of deer, it's probably going to be an older female, her most recent fawns, and then sometimes also some female offspring from the prior year. So younger, not quite adult yet females will also sometimes hang around mom for a while before kind of going off on their own. Males will take off pretty soon. And overall, males are usually solitary, especially during the mating season. They are known to sometimes form what they call bachelor groups, so just groups of unrelated males, but typically they tend to hang out on their own. So white-tailed deer have what's called a home range. So it's just kind of like their territory or like the area they live in. And the size of that home range varies widely across regions and also between the sexes. So males tend to need more space than females. And to get kind of give you an idea of what that space amount is, in Illinois for females, deer living in, say, like the Chicago Forest Preserve or these forested areas need about zero point 0.2 square miles as their home range, whereas in more of the broken up agricultural areas, it's about a half mile squared. Um, and so for the males, you would round up a bit for that. But in my opinion, it's a surprisingly small amount of space. Um, but this also depends region by region. There's some that are much bigger and some that are even smaller than this. And then their life stage or lifespan. Males average around 2.5 years and females are in 5.5. And this is specifically because of hunting. So in areas that have hunting, like Illinois does, um, that puts a lot of pressure, especially on the males and females as well. So you see in areas where either hunting is lifted or there is no hunting, that average lifespan goes up quite a bit for males and a bit for females as well. Um, the maximum in the wild, the maximum age I was able to find for a white-tailed deer was actually a 22-year-old female in Louisiana, which is quite impressive. But usually you don't really see deer older than especially 10 in the wild. It's a rough world, and we're hunting them. So before I get into anything else, I think it's important to establish why we care about white-tailed deer. Um, Given that we all showed up for this talk, we probably already care about white-tailed deer, but it's still good to kind of establish this. First and foremost, white-tailed deer are what are called a keystone species. So a keystone species is one that has a very large impact on the environment, larger than a lot of the other plants and animals around them. A lot of things will depend on that. Either depend on them directly or rely on their impact on the soil or the trees to live their lives uh, well. So when the keystone species is doing really well, that's great for the environment. When the keystone species is not doing very well, that can spell doom for more than even that species. So we want to preserve and keep their populations healthy. They're the largest native herbivore in Illinois, and they're also Illinois' only native cervid species. And so cervids are are a group that include things like moose and elk and reindeer. And so the only one that's native here is the white-tailed deer. So other things we care about, kind of on the darker side, um, white-tailed deer do transmit diseases that are relevant to people and to livestock. They can exchange things like tuberculosis with cattle. They can carry ticks that can give humans things like Lyme disease. So it's important to know about deer and about their habitat and where they are in order to better understand these diseases. They also cause a lot of crop damage. As I I can't count the number of times I've driven past a field and seeing a deer eating from the field. So farmers really care about that. People who eat the food, and as well as the government who has to reimburse the farmers care about that. We also care about deer vehicle accidents, knowing what is deer habitat, where that habitat is, and the likely number of deer that are being supported on that land, is really important for understanding why and where and how accidents occur and how to prevent them. So now that we've kind of established why we care about white-tailed deer, why do we care about their habitat? And so I have here just like a broad definition of habitat, of the environment in which a species naturally lives and grows. And so habitat is critical for any living thing. Um, and because it determines things like health, abundance, or which is another way of saying population size, and for deer as well as human interactions. Are humans in their habitat and near their habitat? Because that can have a big impact on how we interact with them. And there's a lot of factors that go into habitat, but some of the most basic and the most critical include food, shelter and protection. Again, yeah, human activity, because sometimes humans can be a threat, sometimes humans can be a resource. Is there water? They need water to drink. Um, and then edges and connectivity. And so I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on three of these factors, starting with food. Um, so what do white-tailed deer eat? And the answer is a lot of things. They're not super picky, which is probably why they do so well in so many environments. Um, so they'll eat things like leaves, they'll eat your crops, so your corn and your pumpkins and anything else you plant. Those are just examples. They don't discriminate. They'll eat the dogwood trees, they'll eat poison ivy, which is cool. Um, they don't eat a lot of grass. Grass is actually really hard to eat, and wears down teeth a lot. And so that's kind of a specialized thing. So deer don't eat most grasses, but there are some like more delicate, juicier, more tender grass species that they will eat sometimes. They will eat flowers, so like they love cone flowers. They'll eat, they love clover. Um, they'll even eat twigs, and sticks. Usually this is like in the winter when they're getting hangry. They can eat some of the like thinner, newer branches. They'll eat cattails. They love acorns and apples and mushrooms. They'll eat berries. They'll eat the little helicopters that the maple trees put out. And uh, a very concerning fact I learned recently is if they find them on the ground, they will also eat baby birds. And apparently that's actually not uncommon for like cows and stuff will do that. But I don't know. That bugged me for some reason. And so food, like what they eat, matters with habitat because food requirements drive habitat choice. Um, the question is the food there? And if the food's not there, they're not going to be there, because food is essential. And then also like what deer eat varies by season and by what's available. So yeah, they have to eat with the seasons. And so yeah, what they're munching on depends on what's there. So elaborate a little bit more on, okay, what are edges? So when I say edges in this context, I mean where two different types of land come together. And so this photo here shows some forest giving way to grasslands, or some forest and wetlands. Or we see this, or yeah, we see this a lot of the forest against croplands. And so I mention edges because deer do really, really well in areas that have a lot of edges. This is for a variety of reasons, but especially because this kind of juxtaposes resources. So in this photo, uh, those trees are giving the deer shelter. They've got food from those, especially if there's like oak or maple trees. But if it's bumped up right against a cornfield, I mean, hey, that's a buffet. And so it can kind of keep a lot of good resources right together when they otherwise would have to travel farther to reach them. These edges are also easier to move through just because I mean, they're cleared. The stuff that is growing there tends to be newer and younger and easier to eat. So it's a movement thing as well. And lucky for the deer, lucky for us, Illinois has a lot of edges. So that last one that I was going to highlight, connectivity. So that's just a one-word way of saying how things are connected. So say you've got two groups of trees. Their connectivity, at least the way I see it, is like the distance between them, like how close are they together? As well as, is there anything between them? So the dynamic changes if it's crops between them, or if there are people in their houses or neighborhoods between them versus wetlands or other natural areas. And the connectivity is important because we need to understand the deer. We need to know how these areas fulfill the needs that the deer have. And connectivity is one of the important ones because, again, they're moving across these landscapes. They're using all these different land types and moving around. And so they understand that, but we need to understand that as well. And yeah, this connectivity has largely controls if deer can move between areas, if deer and in and out of areas as well. Some deer will disperse when they're young and go off on their own to have new territory, or this movement's important during the mating season for males, typically males moving around to more to find females. So if there's barriers or if there's threats or whatever, or yeah, just barriers to movement, that has a big impact on the deer and their habitat. So you can generally classify things on a range of completely continuous, so like forest for as long as the eyes can see, versus highly fragmented. So very small clumps of trees next to corn, next to wetlands, next to more trees. It's a very more of a small mosaic instead of kind of like the same thing. And in my semi-professional opinion, I would say that deer prefer it closer to the fragmented side, not highly fragmented, because that also, like, then that isn't, there's no like one area that's big enough to live in. But they definitely do really well when the land is kind of chopped up a lot. Again, just having that kind of like mix of resources they do really well in, especially because in Illinois, it's chopped up usually between agriculture and forest and other natural areas. So it's buffet meets other buffet. So, okay, so all right, now we've established why we care about white-tailed deer habitat, but then how do you quantify it? If you have any sort of question, like I do when I do my models relevant to white-tailed deer and their habitat, like how do I even go about putting that into a model? Because I mean, you can define habitat in probably an infinite number of ways, but you got to pick one, and it's got to be good. So first of all, when you're first thinking about this, there's a balancing act. First of all, what is the data that you need, and is it available to you? I mean, that's a huge part. It's great if there's a variable you've identified to include, but if you can't get it, um, that's the end of that. You also have to consider the amount of time and effort it takes to do the analysis. General rule is the more complicated something is, the longer it takes. That goes for pretty much anything, including a model. Uh, and then there's accuracy to the system. I mean, ideally, I'd love to be able to have some sort of metric that includes every single square inch of the ground. But that adds up super quick. And that's not always available as data. And so I have to balance the accuracy of like, okay, what would I find if I just went to that location and looked at it versus being able to approximate it in a good enough way that is not prohibitive to actually being able to finish what you're doing. And then also, this isn't always, this doesn't always matter depending on your question, but if you want, however you quantify to be applicable to other locations, say I want my Illinois metric to be applied to Indiana, well, I have to make sure that it's also applicable to Indiana. Um, and so there are a range of choices when it comes to this in terms of how to represent your habitat. The simplest is a single input. So total area of forest in a county. There you go. But that's pretty crude. And depending on your question, that's actually not very helpful. But then you can go to the other end of a lot of inputs. So you've got different land types, you've got weather, you've got data from deer you've tracked. Those are really, really cool models, and they usually only work for a small area because it's so detailed. And so goes from the not complicated to the extremely complicated. And so I tried to find that middle ground with just a few inputs. And so my research goal overall was to quantify white-tailed deer habitat in Illinois using land classes and their relationships to each other. And so what do I mean by a land class, first of all? So this map here is what is the contents of, I don't remember which year this is, but the National Land Cover Database. And so that's exactly what that sounds like. It's a national database made by the US Geological Survey about land cover. So they basically, this is satellite imagery. They take satellite imagery and then chop up the whole country into a very small grid and then classify all those all those squares in the grid as one sort of land class or another. Um, this is released about every 3 years since 2001, so this is an ongoing data. So it's a continuously updated data set, which is really cool. And so when I say land classes, what I mean is, so here I isolated Illinois because that's what I was interested in. And on the left side is basically the legend of all of the different land classes that I had to work with from the National Land Cover Database. So it's things like water, human development, forest, and grasslands and pasture and crops and wetlands. And so the USGS just maps all this and says, okay, here's this, here's that, here's that. And so as of in 2019, this is what Illinois looked like, according to them. And so this, I mean, it's actually possible to see from here, but if we were to super zoom in, this whole deal is made up of these very, 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 very tiny raster cells. And raster is just a type of data set that's not actually super important. So I'm going to try to just call it a cell. But these are like 0.00035 square miles. So we're talking tiny. Um, and they did this for the whole country, and then I isolated it just for Illinois. Um, and so this is basically a grid that is easier to see if you zoom in more. Um, and then once I had this very big grid, uh, I have to then be like, okay, for my question, I am thinking of white-tailed deer, so I'm going to isolate the land classes that white-tailed deer care about. And so basically knock off the water and the human development and keep the forest and the other natural areas and the croplands as the land classes that deer care about. And so the question is then, okay, now what? So now I have this grid of these land classes on the left. So what do I do with that? Um, so now is the first time and not the last time I will tell you to put your deer goggles on. Um, so since we are interested in white-tailed deer habitat, we have to think like a white-tailed deer. So when this guy looks at the landscape that he's on, he's looking for three things, generally speaking. So he is looking for land that can serve as shelter or food. With shelter, I mean, shelter is like what we'd think of, but yeah, that's where the deer would sleep. That's where they put their babies. That's where they kind of hide out in the winter. Um, and then food is land that feeds them. There is also land that just provides food, no shelter. Then there's land that's not useful to them. So I had to kind of pause and then start looking at this data set through that lens. So just kind of giving a bit more of a visual to these land classes. So there's deciduous forest, so leaf trees, evergreen forest, needle trees, mixed forest is both, woody wetlands or swamp, um, herbaceous wetlands or marsh. There's pasture, shrubs, grasslands, and crops. And crops includes row crops like corn and soy, as well as orchards, that kind of, so like an apple orchard or peaches. Um, so then with those deer goggles on, I then had to classify all of these different land classes into whether they be shelter and food or just food. And so so any of the forests were shelter and food because literally the trees provide shelter and shade and places for the babies to hide and for them to nap. But they also provide food from any of the grasses, the leaves, the nuts, any of those. The pasture is just food, so deer would go there to graze with the cows, but you're not going to find them sleeping there unless they're sick. Um, and then both of the wetlands, those are also both. So again, yeah, they're munching on the plants, but they're also sleeping, not in the water, but in the solid ground. Shrubs, which we don't have a lot of shrubs in shrubland in Illinois, but there was some. That's again, they're just eating. Same with the grasslands, they're eating, and the crops as well. You're not gonna, or hopefully you're not finding them sleeping in your cornfields, but they certainly will be eating. And then once I sat down and classified all of these different land classes into these two groups, um, keeping those goggles on, I had to think about how do deer use the landscape, and deer don't use the landscape these cell by cell. They're not playing chess. They look at a continuous area, and so I had to um, combine the cells and rate them by quality. So the first step to do that was creating what I'd call patches. So a patch was just a group of cells that had the same category. So shelter and food with shelter and food, or food and food. So like in the diagram here, it's either green or yellow. And so pretty basic, alike with like. And so then once they were grouped, now each raster cell had two things. It had a land class, so that original crops, forest, that whole deal, and it had its patch category. So whether was it shelter and food or food. And in addition is, say if I had taken if this yellow patch was just actually that subset of like just four, there was a minimum patch size. So if anything was below a certain area. If it was too small, it was removed because I mean, because like otherwise I would end up with these little like oases of trees in the center of town where it was like 4 trees um, in downtown Champaign. That's not deer habitat, but it registers to the satellite as green. And so having some rules to weed out ones that are too small and not really useful is also super important to make sure that metric is actually capturing reality. So then, okay, great. Now we have our patches. Now what? Still going back to how our deer is seeing that landscape. But then I pull out and put together a table. So this there's a little bit much going on here. But basically what's important is in that very far right column is the habitat quality score. And so this is just a number that ranks the quality of any given cell based on the distance between that cell and the nearest patch of the opposite type of category. So this would be, say, a shelter or food cell, so like maybe a piece of forest. How close is that to the nearest patch of food or like croplands? Because again, that connectivity, the proximity of those is important for how well the deer are able to use it. And this quality score goes down as the distance increases. And for the shelter or food cells, that quality score never goes below 0.6, because in my mind, shelter like as long as it's greater than that patch size minimum, shelter and food land is always useful to deer. There is never a time when it's not useful as long as it's big enough. Whereas with the food, that habitat quality score does go all the way down to 0. And the way I visualized this was you're a lot less likely to see just a deer in the very middle of these absolutely monstrously large agricultural fields. If you do see them there, they're probably either dispersing or they're lost. They don't consider that habitat. That's something they're moving through. That's because there's nothing else for miles. Um, so there is a certain distance at which the food is not really useful to the deer anymore. And these habitat quality scores don't actually have any inherent meaning. They don't have units. Um, they don't have meaning outside of this kind of scoring. They're just relative in size. So a cell with a 1 is more important and more useful and better for deer than one that has a score of 0.2. And then I did this for every single raster cell in Illinois. So every cell to every patch, which took a while. And so I'm going to walk you through really quick what this looks like for like one example. So yeah, say you have a cell with that shelter food, say it's deciduous forest. Um, I then tell the program to look for the nearest patch of food. So say, yeah, this is a cornfield. And then it measures the distance between that food cell or the shelter and food cell, and then the patch. And then whatever distance that is, it then compared it to this table here to find what the score should be. And so since this was 0.35 miles, it fell within the 0.31 to 0.4 range and got a habitat quality score of 8. And this happened for every cell in Illinois. So now we have our raster cell still. It's got its land class, its patch, and now it also has its habitat quality score. But the deer asks a good question of why does this matter? Again, they don't move on a grid. They're not assessing it from 1 to 0, or yeah, 0 to 1. What they're looking at is as a landscape. And so I had to take all of these cells and their scores and turn them into a landscape. So the actual end result was I added together all of the habitat quality scores for all of the cells within different geological areas, different spatial areas. And that ended up being the deer habitat quality score for that area. So I chose 3 different areas. The smallest scale was a TRS. So that's township, range, and section. That's kind of part of the public land survey system. That was a surveying thing they did, again, another grid. Um, and these squares are on average about a mile squared. So they're pretty small. Um, and then the size up was a township. That was more like 37 square miles. And then all the way up to a county. So the average county was around 600 square miles. Obviously, there's bigger and smaller ones. But yeah, so I calculated this total kind of sum of these scores for each of these three geographical areas. Because especially to me, I did this whole project for myself. I am selfish. I have a lot of analyses that happen at the TRS level, at the township level. And before, all of the stuff I was finding only had it at the county level. And so I made my own data sets for this. And hopefully it's useful to other people as well. And so like an example of what this looks like is, so this is for 2021, based on that data set. The deer habitat quality score for Champaign County was 90. But for White County down in Southern Illinois, it was 716.5. And I am guessing that White County has a lot of forest in it. I'm almost certain it is. So whereas, so like, again, these have no units, they're not meaningful outside of this analysis. But what this tells me is that White County has a lot more deer habitat than Champaign County does. And that habitat is better quality, which isn't surprising given how many fields and towns and whatever we have in Champaign County. But yeah, so that's really what this is all about, is the fact that I can then put this in my model and say, okay, a deer from White County might actually be doing better off because the deer habitat quality score is higher than it is in this other county that this other deer is in. That's the general idea. However, something that I have to ask, something that you always have to ask, is the model good? Great, I came up with something. Does it actually reflect reality? Does it make sense? You got to check that before you can take it and run. And there's multiple ways to check these models. The way I chose was I ran a regression model, which is just a big math equation to relate one variable to a bunch of other variables. And I wanted to see whether a higher deer habitat score corresponded to a higher deer population. So this was kind of a logic check of like if a higher deer habitat quality and quantity is needed or can support higher populations, and lower deer populations might reflect lower habitat quality or amount. And that deer population was represented by hunting data. And so the model compares the deer population in 1 year to the deer habitat score. So that sum that I was talking about in the last slide. I also included the variables public hunting, which is the number of public hunting sites, so like state parks usually, in an area, as well as the area of land where hunting was not allowed legally. So mostly human development and then open water. Not that you could really hunt deer on an open lake anyway, and so I included these two because they affect deer population without affecting deer habitat. And so these are other factors that can come into play. So I need to include them as controls. And then I also included the previous year's deer population in as well, because previous population has a huge impact on what the population then next year looks like. And then, so I ran this model and I came up with some statistics. I focused on what is called the R-square. And so the R-square is how well the model fits the data. and R squares closer to 1 are better models. And so I found that at the TRS and the township levels, that R square was around 0.5, or like it explained 50%, which is very solid. And the county was very high, at around 0.97. So that was really good news. That meant that I could be confident in the outcome of all of these models and trust what they were telling me, because it was saying that the model was a really good fit to the data. And so when I looked at that, I looked at the relationships, and I did find that the deer population had a strong positive relationship with the deer habitat score, which was victory. So that means that this model isn't crazy, and it is uh, at least somewhat representative of reality to an extent where I feel comfortable using this as a metric going forward. So I wanted to show you some of the output of these models. So I have at these 3 spatial levels, the TRS, township, and county, with darker colors indicating higher deer habitat quality score. And I did want to focus on the TRS because I was very excited when I got this graph, because I looked at it and I went, well, I can see features that I recognize. I can see the Illinois River. I can tell that there's a lot of crops here, which is a little biased because I also live nearby. Um, I can tell that Chicago is here, and not a lot of deer are living there. So I thought this was useful because this comes with a spreadsheet that I can then use in models, but it's also exciting to see that it's just exciting to see the model reflect what you'd see on the ground, like trees following water is what you see, what a lot of the branching is with all the rivers and streams. So that also brought me comfort that I wasn't out in left field. So then to wrap it up, some final results were, yeah, just as an overview of, like, I got a deer habitat score for all of those different spatial areas over years. And this score, what I'm really proud of is it accounts for both quantity of habitat and quality. A lot of times the data sets I've been seeing, it's a lot of it is quantity, which is great, but you can have areas that are the same size but very different quality, and the deer are going to interact with those very differently. So super happy about that. These new data sets that I generated cover all of Illinois. And in theory, I haven't tested it yet because it's not as relevant to my research at the moment. The methods I use are pretty straightforward, and I don't see why they wouldn't work in other states, especially states nearby. Like maybe it wouldn't work in Hawaii or Maine, but I don't see why it wouldn't work in places like Indiana. And so in theory, in the future, this could be expanded. Um, it is also based on recent and continually updated data, which is huge. I'd like to be doing this for a while. So I'm glad to have a model that's based on data that comes out with a new version every few years. And once the model's built, it's easier. It's not as hard to update that it is to make it in the first place. And then it's also great to have it at the 3 different geographical scales, because depending on the question I'm asking, county might not be relevant. And then it also just accounted for the complicated relationships between deer and habitat. And with that, I would like to acknowledge several people and groups. My study co-authors who did a lot of reading, very much appreciate that. My lab, the Wildlife Veterinary Epidemiology Lab, because without them, I don't have data. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources, because they are the deer managers in the state, and in my opinion, they do a very good job. As well as the Illinois Hunters, because Illinois Hunters in tandem with IDNR are extremely important for whitetail deer management. Population control is a huge issue, and hunters are the main reason we deal with that. So very, very thankful for them, and all the people above. And then thank you for inviting me to talk and for listening and for hopefully having some questions. And now it's time for questions. I do have my email in the bottom right corner. If you missed that and want it later, um, reach out to Holly, reach out to pretty much anybody. I'm happy to answer any questions or if you want a copy of the paper or whatever. And then I just had to share this. One of the women in my lab put white-tailed deer into Chat GPT or one of the image generators, and this is what they thought a white-tailed deer would look like. So I have to curse everyone by sharing this image. And with that, I can take questions. Thank you.
That made me giggle. Um, I just, when I, before you said what they had done, I was like, I think there's some bad pixeling on my, some bad pixeling on my screen. We'll open this up for questions, and as Jameson said, if you wake up in the morning and you think of 3 things that you should have asked tonight, please feel free to email me, and you have my email from registering, or Jameson, who has his in the bottom right
Mhm.
corner. And we will try to get you answers, or we'll try to find the right person to get you the answers if Jameson doesn't know them off the top of his head. So I'm going to
Absolutely.
open this up right now. If anybody that has questions, we'll take questions for a few minutes. Well, they're putting those in. Jameson, where do you see your research going next?
Um, so we are plowing forward with CWD. Um, it's still spreading and it's still increasing. So working on and looking towards a lot of models, which we heavily use the deer habitat for understanding what we can do about it, and whether there is anything we can do about it. I'd also like to, as like pet projects, I have a lot of colleagues that do tech work. I would love to work with them on that for the deer aspect of it. But yeah, a lot of disease, but try to also lighten it up with some non-disease projects as well.
I did see a chat come in.
Okay.
Very interesting work. What question are you using this model to help answer?
So yeah, so it is I have been left up to my own devices, and so I have several projects going. I have used this in a model looking at pregnancy in white-tailed deer, and what impacts it, including like does CWD infection impact it? But I include deer habitat because that can have a huge impact on health and reproduction. I am looking at, oh, what else am I looking at? I'm looking at, yeah, different and evaluating different statistics and how we use them, which pulls in deer habitat. I've looked at fetal development, um, planning on some planning on some models to plan management. So it, it it's kind of a wide variety. Um, but yeah, honestly, it's wherever deer habitat is relevant. And we're very interested in management questions, especially right now.
If you weren't doing white-tailed deer, what would your research be instead right now?
Man, I really don't know. I just like diseases, and so I did the PhD in epidemiology, and so I could have, yeah, gone anywhere. But someone on my committee, uh, who's that's her lab that I'm now part of, she had a position open, so I took it. But yeah, I'm not sure. I've really taken to the wildlife stuff. I find that maybe I'm a little selfish, but the human side can have a lot more elements to it that I find unpleasant. Or it can be very political, very people as patients are a lot harder than deer as patients. So I have, and just I mean, ex any of the extension folks, any DNR, just it's a wildlife folks are a really, really good and wholesome crew. And I very much appreciate appreciate that, while also being very excited about what they do. And I find that refreshing because you don't always find that.
That's good. Neat. Let me see. Is there any other questions that have come in the chat? You must have covered everything because we're not getting a lot of questions, or else they're like, okay, I'll think of this. I don't want to ask it in front of everybody else, but I'll email me late. Yeah, email us later. Um, well, we're thinking next week, we have another Wilderness Wednesday, same way of registering as you did today. Next week's topic is on native bees. And I wasn't aware that it's a controversial topic. So if you have signed up for next week, we just need to remember to be kind and courteous to each other. And then the following week, we are talking about wetlands in cinema. And so we're going to talk about movies and how that changes your opinion of the wetlands. And there's a number of movies out that have wetland scenes in them and how that has really affected how we think about wetlands. And when I was thinking about that, I was like, you never see, I mean, whenever there's wetlands, you see them find bodies in it. There's bad people that go to hide out in the wetlands. So I thought that was interesting. And for someone to do their PhD in that area, I thought was really kind of interesting. So that is next week. If you come up with some more questions for Jameson tonight or any other time, please be sure to let me know and I will push them on to him. Is there any other things that we need to chat about tonight? Otherwise, I really appreciate Jameson, you jumping on and talking to us all about the white-tailed deer.